Hello and welcome to Civil War Weekly, the podcast that answers the question, what happened this week in the American Civil War? I'm your host, Tim Patrick, and this is episode 159, April 1st to April 7th, 1864. Last week, we talked about Forrest and his raid on Paducah, Kentucky. It had been a while since we had visited Paducah. In fact, it was all the way back in 1861 when we started talking about Kentucky being neutral. We also added in a segment on music during the war, which hopefully we have grasped the importance of, having mentioned before in other episodes. This week we're going to shift gears just a little bit. We mentioned the Red River Campaign and introduced that action in a previous episode. If you recall, a big part of that plan was an attempt to coordinate with Frederick Steele and his Arkansas contingent coming down from Little Rock. This part of the operation is going to be important, maybe more so than you might think, so this week we're going to dive into Steele's Camden Expedition. Before we do that, though, of course, we do need to talk about Patreon content, and we are moving into a new month here, so we should have a picture slideshow. We're going to go over some of the battlefields here in the Virginia Overland Campaign and what they look like today. There's quite a few of them. It's going to be a couple episodes I think we might spend on different picture slideshows, but there should be a episode posted here that will at least give us a brief overview of some of the areas, the wilderness, what have you, Spotsylvania. So it'll give us a good idea of what those areas look like. And then we will continue probably in May with a movie review. And this time we will be shifting our attention to Newmarket, right? And we will be talking about The Field of Lost Shoes, which is an interesting movie. And it is, of course, depicting the Battle of Newmarket and the VMI cadets. So we will talk about that as well. So that's what we got going on in the Patreon. And if either of those things sound interesting to you, there is a link in the show description, and those proceeds do go toward the general upkeep of the show. They are greatly appreciated. So let's be reminded of the overall plan real quick, even if we sort of already mentioned it. Banks and his Army of the Gulf will be moving up the Red River Valley, advancing on Kirby Smith's base of Shreveport. He would of course be supported by Porter and the river fleet on his way there. Steele, meanwhile, would be coming down from Little Rock in columns converging. We have Halleck's correspondence about the campaign. It is necessary that the flag be restored to some on point in Texas that can be best and most safely effected by a combined military and naval movement up the Red River to Alexandria, or Shreveport, and the military occupation of northern Texas. By adopting the line of the Red River, you retain your connection with your own base and separate still more the 2 points of the rebel confederacy. Moreover, you cut northern Louisiana and southern Arkansas entirely off from supplies and reinforcements from Texas. I write this simply as a suggestion and not as military instruction. Now, that last part is especially telling of Halleck. He's constantly coming up with these instructions. He's not really ordering anyone to do anything. That's why he sort of fails as being the overall Army commander. He's a really good administrator. He's not a very good planner. Even if that first Corinth campaign, not particularly good at planning, doesn't fight a real battle. Obviously, he's able to capture the town, and that does shift some attention away, especially after the Battle of Shiloh. However, like I said, this latter part of the correspondence is going to be fairly important. But we get the idea here that we need to capture Shreveport. We can cut off pieces of the Confederacy. We've already sort of cut it in half with the Mississippi River, and now we can continue to cut pieces off. And it does kind of illustrate sort of the outgoing thought process of the federal armies and the federal strategy. You know, we need to get into Texas. We need to get into all these different states. Well, Grant's going to come up with a completely separate strategy of we need to isolate their field armies. We need to make it so they can't converge on any one point. They're obviously manpower deficient, so we need to make sure to eliminate their capability to shift troops around. But we also need to be able to support each other if we need to. So some disaster happens, we need to be able to shift troops around. And so remember we talked about interior lines and this is interior lines probably on a grander scale outside of a battlefield, more on the campaign side. And obviously moving into Texas, moving up the Red River even, is not going to be conducive of that plan. We mentioned that there would be issues in trying to coordinate with the columns. Remember that Arkansas and this region of Louisiana would be underdeveloped, and there would be a large amount of space between Steele and his comrades. Steele, in fact, is going to be completely oblivious as to what the Army of the Gulf is doing in their neck of the woods. It's been a little while since we checked in with Steele. If you remember, he had captured Little Rock and Pine Bluffs and had been otherwise sitting idle, Sterling Price and a small amount of Confederates having backed off. Price was not the same commander he once was. No longer was he the hero of Wilson's Creek, an early scion of the war. But despite facing this less than stellar opponent, Frederick Steele had his misgivings. Of course, there are communication issues, but also major logistical issues. Recently, I have seen a new look on Gettysburg that suggests that logistics play a big role in determining where the battle was fought, and if we put that into context, Gettysburg is not exactly a random spot on the map. While I know we are not trying to get into a Gettysburg tangent, logistical issues will plague southern Arkansas. There is really only one navigable river, and the country, what development there is picked very clean. In fact, with supply lines stretched, there would be more threats with partisans and other nefarious individuals to prey on the wagon trains, having to form a lifeline for a fairly large-sized force. Steele would dispatch in reference to his supposed support of Banks. General Banks with 17,000 and 10,000 of Sherman's will be at Alexandria on the 17th of March instant. This is more than equal for anything Kirby Smith can bring against him. Smith will run. By holding a line of Arkansas secure, I can soon free this state from armed rebels. Sherman insists upon my moving upon Shreveport to cooperate with the above-mentioned forces with all my effective force. I am prepared to do so against my own judgment. The roads are most, if not quite, impracticable. The country is destitute of provisions on the route. I made a proposition to General Bates to threaten the enemy's flank and rear with my cavalry, and to make a feint with infantry on the Washington Road. I advise that you proceed to cooperate in the movement of Banks and Sherman on Shreveport, unless General Grant orders differently. Halleck would respond that a feint would be insufficient, and so preparations were needed to be made. Sherman had actually backed Steele's suggestions, so we have a split kind of jury here. While we have not mentioned Grant as a commander of all the Union armies, we will mention his strategy in connection with the Red River Campaign and Camden Expeditions. You see, Grant wanted to have coordinated offenses, which eliminated the Confederate field armies, as we have already mentioned. Meade against Lee, Sherman against Johnson, additional armies moving up the James, and then up the Shenandoah. But also importantly, he wanted Banks to move on Mobile. This would relatively centralize the army somewhat, providing the various support needed, while also denying the enemy that same option. Halleck had already made these preparations, and so Grant, not wishing to embarrass Halleck, would allow for the Red River Campaign and Camden to proceed. If Grant had known Halleck was talking behind his back, well, maybe things would have been different. The goal was going to be finished with this campaign quickly. Steele takes over, then Banks will turn his attention to Mobile. As it was, he was moving away from support and allowing Polk, you remember Polk being in Mississippi from Oklahoma, to actually join Johnson in Georgia. The good part of the campaign would be that the Union armies were going to confuse Smith, as we will soon see. Most of the major players in the campaign we have met before. Of course, we have Price, who slid down from his once hero status after Whistling Creek. He has constantly been trying to make sure Missouri is not forgotten, which gets him into some troubles with Jefferson Davis, if you recall. Theophilus Holmes has been pretty ineffectual in his role over Arkansas, so Price seemed to be at least a decent replacement. Kirby Smith was unsure of whether Price was really the right guy for the job, but we have highlighted how officer deficient this region was, so he was better than nothing. His primary subordinates we've already mentioned too. James Fagan will have cavalry in the District of Arkansas. He will have brigades under William Cabell, Thomas Dockery, and William Crawford. Dockery has already seen action, commanding a regiment under Bowen during the Vicksburg campaign. Cabell you remember from Devil's Backbone. Marmaduke would also hold a cavalry command, brigades under Shelby and Colton Green. Green had been an aide for Claiborne Fox Jackson earlier in the war. Samuel Maxey would have an additional cavalry command, a West Pointer who had served in the West, and the war with Mexico. He will go on to practice politics in Texas after the conflict. Walker and his Texan Greyhounds would also be under Price, with brigades under Wall, Scurry, and Randall, all in that command. Thomas Churchill would also hold a division command, his brigades under Tappan, Lucien Gause, and Alexander Hawthorne. Gause was a lawyer who will go on to serve in the U.S. House of Representatives for Arkansas after the war. Hawthorne was also a lawyer who has seen action already in previous campaigns, including Helena. Mosby Parsons will also have a Missouri contingent. He has been with us from the State Guard days and will go into Mexico after the war, where he will be murdered. The Union Army will have again familiar faces. Frederick Steele will be in overall command, as we have mentioned. He had attended West Point and served in Mexico prior to the war, and used his personal connection with Grant to gain his independent command. Frederick Salmon, Eugene Carr, and John Thayer will be the 3 division commanders. Salmon, you remember from Helena being the primary defender there. He will start to hate officers from West Point, as others have done in other parts of our story. Thayer, you recall, had been instrumental to Nebraska and its creation, commanding troops in prior campaigns to great effect. Carr, you remember, gets a Medal of Honor at Pea Ridge. He had put together a reputation as a capable officer, with the only blemish being receiving criticism from McClernand, who brought in to question his ability. Carr would not be the only one to bump heads with John McClernand, however, as we have highlighted in the past. Carr in this campaign will be in charge of a cavalry division in Steele's small army. Salmon will have brigades under Samuel Allen Rice, William McLean, and Adolph Engelman. Rice was a former Attorney General of Iowa and had been a player in the Republican Party. Engelman, like Salmon, was born in Germany and actually served in the Mexican-American War prior to the Civil War. Engelman would have a lot of German immigrants in his command. Thayer would have brigades under John Edwards, Charles Adams, and Owen Bassett. Edwards was a politician from Iowa and would go on to be a Republican politician in Arkansas after the war. Interestingly, Edwards would have 2 U.S. Arkansas regiments under his command, and Adams would have 2 Kansas colored regiments, if you remember the 1st and 2nd Kansas from previous action, including Honey Springs. They would actually be coming down from the Department of the Frontier, reinforcing the expedition. Likewise, Maxey will be arriving from the Indian Territory, showing how there were troops being pulled from wherever available. Late March would see the expedition kick off, not long after the Red River Campaign began with the capturing of Fort DeRussy. Smith would continue to have the same strategy he will employ in that area as well, a Fabian one, instructing Price to avoid a general engagement while withdrawing. Joe Shelby would be sent to operate in the rear of Steele's command, the aggressive cavalry being a strength for the Confederates, although facing a larger force. The Union Army would not get off to a good start. As mentioned, there would be logistical problems. No railroads would mean anything brought with the troops would need to be transported by animal. Already there was a shortage of supplies, however, the Yankees being placed on half rations. Smith would instruct his commanders to acquire supplies where available. But Smith had done a good job of picking the countryside clean and thus denying the enemy. Heavy rains likewise would make progress difficult, with poor road conditions and swollen waterways. But remember that much like all the operations, communication would be a big issue. Thayer would be delayed several days and would have no way of giving word to Steele. Steele, in the meantime, would make his way toward the rendezvous point at Arkadelphia. In the process, some of his forces, who remained in Pine Bluff, would successfully confuse 2 Confederate brigades, engaging them at a place called Mount Ida. Raids would be launched in different directions, capturing the Confederates off guard. Additionally, when the enemy was engaged, the smaller Union forces were able to fend off their attacks. The commander of the expedition wrote of the action. The enemy broke in the wildest confusion, and from this, his retreat was a perfect rout. The road and timber were strewn with blankets, saddlebags, hats, and guns, and prisoners were being constantly brought in and sent to the rear. The pursuit was vigorously kept until we arrived at a point about 5 miles from Mount Elba, where the road crosses Big Creek. Here the enemy succeeded in tearing up about 20 feet of the bridge, carrying off the plank. The creek would not be forded. We were consequently very suddenly and effectively checked. Sergeant August Bondy, an Austrian immigrant from the 1848 revolutions turned Union soldier, confirmed Clayton's report in his recollections while adding a few details from the perspective of the common soldier. He stated, "As the 5th Kansas Cavalry came in from across the river, the engagement began to wax warm. We dismounted and deployed. Company K ordered to support 2 howitzers of the 1st Indiana and a detail of the 28th Wisconsin Infantry already in position. Went in on double quick with the 28th Wisconsin detail to an old log corn crib for shelter, using the cracks for loopholes. This being just opposite the enemy's center, greatly contributed to the repulse of his charges. During the action, one of the 28th Wisconsin men by the cabinet was hit in the forehead and fell back dying. While I tried to raise him up, both of the howitzers discharged, and my left ear became deaf, and has remained so since then. The enemy, without artillery, retreated, and Colonel Clayton ordered me to take a squad across the river and scout. The cavalry was ordered to charge and harass the retreating enemy, which we did, till we came to a very defective bridge, partially destroyed, where we halted." So with the Confederates thus occupied, Steele would get to Arkadelphia, but without Thayer there, it would be an issue. His men were burning through already dwindling supplies. He would not be able to wait much longer, especially as Price becomes more reinforced. Cavalry would skirmish, and there would be guerrilla attacks. The irregulars in their actions even further afield would hamper the already tenuous line of supply. Moving out would seem to be the only option. The Union forces would be so hampered by the mounted rebels that they would try to light leaves on fire as a screen, although smoke into their faces made this a pretty bad plan. Steele would decide that his best course of action would be to take Camden. Now, we might have talked a little bit about Camden a while back. This town sits on the Wachita River and could give him a waterborne supply route. It was, however, very heavily fortified, and now Price was going to try to dig his heels in. Action would first occur at a place called Elkins Ferry. Now, this ferry spanned the Little Missouri River. You see, crossing this river would mean that the Northerners could get at Camden more efficiently. Marmaduke's cavalry would be guarding ferry sites on this waterway, and so would contest the Union advance. Lieutenant Colonel Francis Drake, the future founder of Drake University, would be tasked with establishing a foothold. He would hold off against Confederate attacks long enough for reinforcements to arrive, and thus secure the crossing. We have a Colonel McLean, his superior, with the account. The day after my arrival, occasional firing along my picket lines and skirmishing in front convinced me that the enemy were on the alert, either for the purpose of watching the movements of the army, of which my brigade constituted the advance guard, or if possible, by a direct attack upon me in overwhelming numbers, to cut me off before reinforcements could be obtained from across the river. Early in the morning of the 3rd instant, I ordered Major Norris of the 43rd Indiana to proceed with 4 companies of that regiment to the front to reconnoiter the position of the enemy, deploy the men as skirmishers, and support the cavalry pickets. He soon succeeded in discovering the position of the advanced pickets and skirmishers of the enemy, drove them back for some distance, pressing them so closely that the retreat of a number of them being cut off, 16 came into our line and surrendered. On the same evening, being satisfied that the enemy were in our front and in force, designed to attack us during the night or the next morning, I ordered Lieutenant Colonel Drake, 36th Iowa, to proceed with 3 companies from that regiment and 3 companies from the 43rd Indiana to a position on the main road leading from the fort immediately in our front, to deploy his men on the right and left of the road, to watch the movements of the enemy and to resist their approach as long as was prudent, and retire to the reserves when they approached in force. One section of artillery under Lieutenant Peets was planted so as to fully command the road. At 6 o'clock on the morning of the 4th, the enemy approached in force and commenced an attack on the advance companies of Lieutenant Colonel Drake, who resisted them gallantly for nearly 2 hours, being well supported by the artillery of Lieutenant Peets. Too much praise cannot be awarded to Colonel Drake for the very distinguished gallantry and determined courage he exhibited during the contest. The capture by his forces early in the morning of a rebel lieutenant and aide-de-camp of General Marmaduke confirmed me in the belief that the general was near in person, with a large portion of his division. After a very lively skirmish of nearly 2 hours, the enemy having discovered the position of our battery and replying to it vigorously with 4 pieces of artillery, our pickets and advanced skirmishers were driven back on the left upon the infantry reserves, while upon the right they maintained their position. The enemy, since ascertained to be General Cabell's brigade, 1,600 strong, charged with a yell upon our left, for the purpose of flanking us and capturing our battery. Their approach from the cover of the timber was met gallantly by 2 or 3 well-directed volleys from the 36th Iowa. Immediately after the charge and repulse of the enemy, the reinforcements sent by me arrived, consisting of the 29th Iowa and the 9th Wisconsin, of Brigadier General Rice's brigade. But before they were put into position by him, the enemy withdrew. Not, however, until a grape shot from the battery had inflicted a slight wound upon the general's head, from the effect of which, I'm gratified to say, he recovered. Casualties were 54 on the Confederate side compared to 38 on the Union side. Marmaduke would withdraw to Prairie du Anne and start digging in the face of his superior Union force. On the positive side for Steele, although supplies were still an issue, Thayer and the Frontier Division finally arrived, giving him the additional manpower. Interestingly, the Frontier Division was a little rough when compared with their western counterparts, who, should be said, were considered to be rough when compared with their eastern soldiers, so it's a funny mix of armies. Price, it should be said, could only muster some 7,000 men, mostly cavalry, to the field, so now Steele would be able to push. Now that's also pretty characterizing of the first actions in the Camden Expedition, is that it is pretty largely a mounted force. We mentioned how, in cavalry in particular, every 4th man is used to hold horses, so you're taking away from your combat effectiveness there, and even then, you're probably not armed quite as well as the Union infantry is. Where the Union army here lacks in cavalry, they do have a lot of infantry, and they're going to be just generally better armed, right? So, that being said, Price is really not able to actually have a stand-up fight with Frederick Steele. He can't meet him in the field. He's already outnumbered, he's outgunned. Obviously, any artillery that he has, especially as we get into these farther sectors of the war from the Confederacy, they're just going to be deficient in supplies. We've highlighted that before. Guns, cannon, not going to be as great as in the East. So, he's not going to be able to have a decisive battle as maybe Price would have liked. It's pretty frustrating for him to just keep giving up ground. What Price did do was find a very good defensive position at Prairie du Anne, at a ridge, a place called Gum Grove. High ground and a good field of fire would be imposing to the Blue-clad infantry. They would make contact on April 9th with this new line that the Confederates possessed. Remember, though, that Price was instructed by Smith to keep falling back. Time was important. The more supplies dwindled, the less Steele was going to be able to operate. Frederick Salmon and his division, as well as Carr's, would begin their skirmishing with the Confederates at Gum Grove. Artillery would likewise duel, but the Confederates had inferior weapons. Salmon would conclude that as darkness set in, he would take the position by assault. This he did rather easily, his men taking Gum Grove in a lightning strike that saw a hasty rebel retreat. This was even more surprising considering it was a night attack, not usually seen in the Civil War, as we know, and even less successful. Price would continue to form a defensive line on the prairie, and here we have a mix-up when it comes to discerning the enemy objectives. We know that Steele was trying to get at Camden, which would allow the campaign to continue if he was going to be resupplied by river. Washington, Arkansas, was at that time the seat of the Confederate government, though, so Price assumed that's where he would strike further south. He kept this in mind and would try to set up a surprise attack for the Yankees. Steele, however, continued to push the enemy off the open ground and turned east toward his real objective. Price would realize very late his error in judgment, but what he did have in his favor was that the entirety of his command was mounted, so he could pull quick maneuvers. Shelby was just the hard rider to get in front of the Yankee column, eventually setting up at Poison Spring. In the meantime, Dockery would surprise Thayer on the march at Moscow, and crucially, almost get into the Union supply wagons, inflicting 31 casualties in the process. Quick thinking and counterattacks by the 1st Arkansas U.S. and the 2nd Kansas Colored Troops would secure the critical wagons. Price, had he funneled more troops in this attempt, could have essentially ended the campaign there. Shelby and the rest of Marmaduke's command, though, would be placed in front of Carr's and Rice's brigade, and thus stop their advance. And we will pick back up on what's going on with the Camden Expedition in 2 weeks' time. But just as we conclude this first part of the campaign, we see that Frederick Steele really has 2 objectives. It would be very nice if he could get Price to fight a battle in the open, right? It'd be very nice for him to have a decisive victory. That way, he's able to maneuver without kind of any hindrance. As it is, though, Price is ordered to give ground. He doesn't have the right personnel, as we mentioned, to really give battle. So the delaying actions are really what's hurting Steele. Either have a decisive battle, or he's going to want to get to Camden, and then could be a possibility of resupply. Or we might be able to strengthen the supply lines. Remember, too, though, the part of the problem is that whatever thousands of men that you have in the Civil War, you're going to need a very large amount to really secure your supply lines and make sure those aren't going to be raided by guerrillas, by Confederate cavalry, by criminals, right? So you are going to need to have more on paper than what you're actually going to be using to fight battles with. So Steele doesn't necessarily have that. And we can really see how the campaign is really not planned particularly well. He's just sort of ordered to link up with Banks at some point. There's really no thought into how he's going to be able to do that, how he's going to communicate with the guy. So get to Camden, resupply. Maybe he's going to be able to hear from Banks. If he's able to be resupplied by water, that could open up a communication route, and thus the campaign can continue. However, as we're going to see here in future episodes, the Confederates are going to have something if they're going to get at their supply wagons, right? Any kind of resupply efforts, any kind of wagons that they already have, they're going to have something in terms of a strategy, a way to sort of defeat Steele and even Banks if we're able to get at their supplies. They're not going to be able to operate in this part of the country. Kirby Smith, for what it's worth, does come up with a pretty good strategy to deny the enemy, and thus we're going to see that being an emphasis here in a future episode. Let's call it a day right there. We have spent the entirety of the episode talking about the 1864 Camden, Arkansas expedition. We will switch gears next week and go to the Red River Campaign proper. Additionally, we need to talk about one of the more controversial episodes of the war in Fort Pillow. If you like what you hear, please make sure to leave a review. Posted in the description should be a link to the website as well as Patreon information. Support for the general upkeep of the show is greatly appreciated. Feedback's always welcome. Questions, comments, concerns. The email is cwweeklypod@gmail.com. Thank you all so much for listening, and have a great week.